Welcome back to the deep dive. We're here to really get into the source material, figure out what's going on, and why it actually matters to you.
Exactly. Think of us as your guides through the sometimes pretty dense world of Congress. We're trying to make sense of it all.
And today, we're diving straight into the official record. We've got excerpts from the Congressional Record for June 6th, 2025. So this is, the real deal.
Right. Not news reports, not opinion pieces, but the actual floor speeches, bills being introduced, committee actions, the day-to-day business of the House.
Our mission, really, is to unpack this specific day. What were the big themes? What were the clashes? And ultimately, why should you care about what happened on this random Friday in June?
Yeah, it's amazing what you can learn from just one day's record. You get a real snapshot of everything Congress is juggling.
Totally. So let's kick things off. Where does the record start for June 6th?
Well, it starts, as you might expect, with the formal stuff. The opening prayer, the Pledge of Allegiance. Pretty standard procedure.
But the prayer itself you mentioned was a bit different.
It was, yeah. It wasn't just, a generic invocation. It actually pulled in references from different traditions and specifically asked for virtues like humility, courage, integrity, compassion, and leaders.
Mm.
There was this line, released each one of us from ego so that we may serve selflessly. And this idea that we belong to one family, recognizing the entire human race as one.
That's a pretty powerful way to start the day, especially given how divided things can feel. An aspirational note, maybe.
Definitely felt that way. And right after that, there was another kind of unique moment, an homage specifically,
An homage to who?
to martyrs worldwide, people who fought for liberty, justice, equality.
Yeah.
But what really stood out were these specific Punjabi phrases they used.
Oh, wow. Like what?
Let me see. Smoo Shahid Nu Kat Kat Parnam, which they translated as my homage to all martyrs in the world. And then Wahiguru Ji Ka Khalsa, meaning the Khalsa belongs to God, and Wahiguru Ji Ki Fateh, victory belongs to God.
You really don't hear that every day on the House floor. It shows how members can bring their own communities and perspectives right into these opening moments.
Absolutely. It's brief, but it says a lot. After those more ceremonial parts, it shifts into the nitty-gritty procedural stuff.
Like approving the journal from the day before.
Exactly that. Basically, signing off on the official record of what happened last time.
Yeah.
It sounds dry, but it's fundamental legislative
Going
housekeeping.
to keep the minutes, right.
Pretty much. And then you see these unanimous consent requests pop up.
Which are usually for routine things, scheduling and stuff.
Yeah, non-controversial items, mostly. So one was just setting the schedule adjourn Friday, come back Monday. That got approved.
Standard weekend break.
Right. And another adjusted the size limits for the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence for this Congress, the 119th. No more than 27 members, no more than 15 from one party.
So even the rules for committees can get tweaked by agreement. Shows a bit of flexibility, I guess.
When there's consensus, yeah. So that sets the stage. After the formalities and procedures, a big chunk of the record is often these 1-minute speeches.
Ah, yes, where members get like 60 seconds to sound off on pretty much anything.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And they're fascinating because they give you this window into what individual representatives are focused on, what they're hearing back home, or what national issues they want to flag.
And you see a lot of tributes in those, right? Honoring people from their districts.
A ton of tributes, yeah. Veterans, community leaders, teachers, police. It's a common way to use that minute. For instance, there was a really nice tribute to A.E. Peter Pierce from Mississippi.
Okay.
An Army vet, public servant, remembered for just quiet service. Coaching Little League, mowing the church lawn, being a friend to the forgotten, just a life lived for others seemed like the message.
Sounds like a pillar of the community type.
Exactly. And then there was Jerry Danforth of Wisconsin, a really distinguished tribal leader. He'd been chairman of the Oneida Business Committee multiple times, a judge too.
Yeah.
And a decorated Navy vet, over 30 years, Vietnam, Desert Storm.
Wow. Quite a resume.
Yeah. And his legacy was tied to things like economic development for the Oneida Nation, healthcare, language preservation, looking beyond just gaming for sustainability.
Important work.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And then you had folks like Marcy May Perrin from Ohio, lifelong resident, service at a school, but she was apparently known as the queen of Pee Wee football.
Really?
Yeah. Founding member, treasurer for the board for like 50 years, made sure kids could play. They said many kids called her mom. It's these stories,
Yeah.
Ordinary people making a huge difference.
That's great. And there were others too, you said.
Oh, yeah, lots. John Farrow from Pennsylvania, born in Italy, community service focus. Joel Willis in Georgia helped expand Epworth by the Sea, boosted the local economy. Federal Glover in California, first black supervisor in Contra Costa County, big on transportation projects, youth engagement. Passed away recently, it seems.
So a real cross-section of lives being honored?
Absolutely. Former Congresswoman Jane Pratt, Joseph Calabrigo retiring from Danville, Pastors Charles and Michelle King for their ministry and food distribution. The list goes on. It's Congress using its platform to say thank you to people making a difference back home.
Okay, so besides the individual tributes, what else were members using their one-minute speeches for?
Well, marking national observances was a big one. Like National Trails Day was coming up on June 7th.
Oh, right.
So one speaker talked about the trails at Jake's Rocks in Pennsylvania. It was the 2024 Trail of the Year. They mentioned mountain biking, the views. But the interesting part was framing trails as more than just fun, as investments in public health, economic development, and quality of life. And a reminder to unplug and reconnect. Credited volunteers, local leaders. It puts a policy spin on enjoying the outdoors.
Makes sense. What
Health
else?
fatherhood, gotta mention. A resolution recognizing dads was reintroduced. They cited some data-positive impacts on kids' schooling, avoiding crime, thriving economically. But the emphasis was really on the inherent dignity of fathers, beyond just the numbers.
Yeah.
And Pride Month was highlighted. A speaker from Houston talked about their big parade and shouted out specific local groups doing important work. Foundation Latino Americana de Acción Social, Legacy Community Health, Montrose Center, providing care, housing, support for the LGBTQIA+ community.
So celebrating community efforts.
Yes, but that speech also took a sharp turn. It included some pretty strong criticism of colleagues who were targeting trans kids. The speaker called the kids brave and ended with a powerful message. I see them, I hear them, and I will fight for them. In Texas, when we say all, that means all.
Wow, so it went from celebration straight into political commentary. Shows how versatile those one-minute slots can be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then there was Building Safety Month 2025, recognizing the folks who make sure our buildings are safe, the International Code Council members, engineers, inspectors.
Kind of unsung heroes, maybe.
You could say that, but they tied it to some compelling data. Modern building codes, they argued, aren't just red tape. They're projected to prevent $600 billion in disaster spending by 2060.
Ooh.
Yeah, and deliver $11 in savings for every $1 invested in mitigation. That's a really strong economic case for safety regulations, especially with climate change bringing more extreme weather.
That reframes it completely, not just safety, but fiscal responsibility, too.
Exactly. And members also recognized achievements outside government, like a women's rowing team won a national championship. They mentioned the coach getting an award, a student with the highest GPA, even a personal connection, my son's former teammate.
Little local pride moments.
Yeah. And the Coachella Football Club got recognized, too. A soccer organization praised for lifting up young athletes and inspiring the community with details about their teams having undefeated seasons.
Nice.
But probably the most recurring theme, given the date June 6th, was the 81st anniversary of D-Day.
Ah, of course. That would loom large.
Definitely. Several members spoke about it. Mr. LaMalfa gave this really vivid picture of the landings. Over 150,000 troops, intense gunfire, knowing many wouldn't make it back. The grit, the sacrifice.
Hard to imagine.
He mentioned Saving Private Ryan as capturing the chaos, the hail of bullets when those landing craft doors dropped. But they went anyway, he said, out of duty to stop the Nazis. His main point was, we owe them so much. And he invoked that movie, quote, earn this, urging people to be good citizens.
A powerful connection.
Then Mr. Desaulniers honored Papa Jake Larson, a WWII vet, D-Day survivor. Apparently he lied about his age, enlisted at 15.
Get out though.
Yeah. Survived Omaha Beach, fought in 6 major battles, including the Bulge. But the really striking part now, he's huge on TikTok and Instagram.
Seriously, a D-Day survivor on TikTok.
Over 1.3 million followers. He tells his stories, teaches history online, keeping that memory alive in a totally modern way.
That's incredible. What a legacy.
And Mrs. Shu honored Mel McMullen, one of the Flying Tigers, on his 100th birthday. He served in the China-Burma-India theater before the U.S. officially entered the war, flew dangerous missions over the hump, the supply route over the Himalayas. She called him an embodiment of the American spirit.
Just amazing stories of that generation.
And Mr. Roy also touched on D-Day. He reflected on what those heroes fought for freedom, but also pointedly mentioned what they didn't fight for. And that connects directly to a big debate he led later in the day about the national debt.
Ah, setting the stage. So D-Day was clearly a major point of reflection.
Huge. And alongside the veterans, there was also significant recognition for Teacher Appreciation Week and Police Week.
Right, often happen around the same time.
Yes, so several members highlighted outstanding educators like Dana McCoy, Chris Wardlaw, Dr. Jennifer Sanford, detailing their specific roles, their passion, how they go above and beyond for students, developing new programs, mentoring, really specific examples of impact.
Important to recognize that work.
Same for law enforcement. Deputies Jeff Bilodeau and Chad Blair, Lieutenant Jason Doolittle, Detective Dan Heaton, Officer Brett Schneider. Again, members highlighted their years of service, specific expertise like mentorship, investigations, traffic safety, working with kids online. The common thread was dedication and positive impact.
Good to see that recognition happening formally.
Yeah, Dr. Marcy Khaled and Detective Wolf got mentions too. And even a local landmark. The login in Indiana celebrated its 200th anniversary,
Yeah.
a trading post from 1825.
Wow, 200 years. That's history right there.
And one last example tying local to federal. A member highlighted the Indianapolis International Airport.
As an economic driver.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mentioned a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project completion, 53 nonstop destinations, being FedEx's second biggest hub, and a new Aer Lingus flight as proof of the region's global reach. It's a way to show how federal focus on infrastructure, even indirectly, helps local economies thrive.
Okay, so that gives us a good feel for the opening part of the day. The rituals, the local shout-outs, the acknowledgments.
Right, the pulse of daily congressional life. But then, the record shifts into some pretty significant policy debates that were happening right there on the House floor.
This is where things get more heated, I imagine.
Often, yeah. This is where you see the real legislative clashes. A big one on this day centered around a bill, H.R. 2966. It was called the American Entrepreneur's First Act.
Okay, what was that about?
It dealt with requirements for getting certain loans from the Small Business Administration, the SBA, specifically the Main Loan Program, Section 7A, and another called Title V.
And what were the requirements the bill wanted to put in place?
According to proponents, like Mr. Keeley, who spoke in favor, it would basically codify rules requiring applicants and business owners to provide their date of birth, certify that the business is 100% owned by U.S. citizens, nationals, or lawful permanent residents.
100%. That sounds strict.
Very, and certify that no owner, direct or indirect, is what they called an ineligible person.
And who counts as ineligible?
The bill defined that as asylees, refugees, visa holders, or basically any non-citizen classified as a non-immigrant.
Okay, so it's tightening access based on immigration status. What was the argument for doing that?
Mr. Keeley argued it was putting into law rules from President Trump's executive order and guidance from SBA Administrator Lafler. The goal, he said, was to end taxpayer subsidization of open borders and help actual American citizens on Main Street start businesses.
All right. And the opposition. You said it was strong?
Oh, very strong. Ms. Velasquez led the charge against it. Her main point was that SBA loans should go to credit-worthy businesses, period, including immigrant-owned businesses that, follow the rules, pay taxes, create jobs for Americans.
So merit over status.
That was the core argument. And a huge point of contention was the justification for the bill. Proponents talked about fraud, but Ms. Velasquez was adamant. She said there was not a shred of evidence shared with Congress, the public, the Inspector General, anyone, to back up claims of widespread fraud involving these groups.
So she's saying the premise is flawed.
She basically accused Republicans of blindly relying on the SBA administrator's word and her empty rhetoric, demanding real facts, not fabricated ones. She suggested their support might stem from one unproven case and maybe confusion over older, less strict rules.
What about the practical side? How would this work for lenders?
That was another major concern she raised. She argued it puts huge compliance burdens on lenders. How are they supposed to verify citizenship for every single owner, down to the last %, especially in complex ownership structures? She said they're not equipped, and it exposes them to legal risk under civil rights laws, like the Equal Credit Opportunity Act.
That sounds complicated.
And potentially discriminatory was the implication. Plus, a really big red flag for opponents was the idea that this information, detailed citizenship info on every owner, could be shared with immigration enforcement.
Turning the SBA into an immigration agency.
Essentially, yeah. She argued it makes the SBA an enforcement arm of DHS, which is not what the SBA is for. The fear is it would deter eligible immigrants from even applying.
So who exactly gets excluded under this bill, according to the opposition?
Mrs. Velasquez specifically mentioned legally operating entrepreneurs, people with DACA, people with temporary protected status, TPS, visa holders, refugees, folks who are legally present, working, paying taxes, contributing to Social Security, but wouldn't meet that strict 100% citizen LPR ownership rule. And this info is needed just to be considered for a loan, she stressed, which is different from some past reporting rules.
Were outside groups weighing in?
Yes, she cited letters from the small business majority and Unidos US opposing the bill. Small business majority argued it hurts businesses with foreign investors, even if majority U.S. owned, and ignores that immigrant communities are vital entrepreneurial hubs. Unidos US called it part of a broader effort to scapegoat immigrants that ultimately harms American businesses.
So, a fundamental disagreement on who deserves access, fueled by a dispute over the evidence of fraud, and concerns about discrimination and implementation.
That sums it up pretty well, and the record shows how it played out. H.R. 2966 did pass the House after this debate, but the vote was quite divided, with 190 members voting against it. It clearly shows a deep partisan split on this intersection of immigration and economic policy.
Okay, moving beyond the SBA debate, what other policy areas saw action or discussion?
Healthcare and social programs definitely came up, often with a real sense of urgency.
Like what?
Well, Ms. Dean made a very passionate plea about the situation in Gaza. She talked about the risk of starvation for, she said, half of the 2.3 million people there.
A dire situation.
She specifically claimed that Prime Minister Netanyahu was blocking entry for about 170,000 metric tons of aid. While she stressed wanting hostages returned, her main thrust was this moral appeal. Where is our humanity? Where is our compassion? She described seeing photos of suffering children, just sitting there out of reach, really trying to convey the human cost.
A humanitarian call to action.
Exactly. And relatedly, Mr. Magaziner spoke about foreign aid funding. He said it was the 17th time he demanded the Trump administration restore funding for life-saving food aid, calling the pause unnecessary and unconscionable.
He blamed the administration directly for pausing aid.
Yes. And interestingly, he used a quote from Marco Rubio from before Rubio joined the Trump administration, arguing that foreign aid is tiny, less than 1% of the budget, and cutting it won't solve budget problems. A clear attempt to counter fiscal arguments against aid.
So pushing back on justifications for aid cuts.
Right. But funding cuts were a major theme beyond foreign aid, too. There was a specific focus on the Crystal Lake mental health program.
What happened there?
A speaker reported that $5.6 million in federal funding impacting over 100 communities was abruptly canceled, again attributing the cut to the Trump administration.
And where did that funding originally come from?
This was key. It came from the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. That was the bill passed with Republican and Democratic support after the Uvalde school shooting, specifically aimed at tackling the youth mental health crisis.
So bipartisan funding for mental health was cut.
That was the claim. The speaker detailed the impacts, disrupting care for over 7,000 students, making it harder to spot warning signs of distress or potential violence, undermining efforts to reduce stigma. They linked it to the awful statistic about suicide being the second leading cause of death for young teens.
That's deeply concerning.
And the speaker drew a direct line, saying, Republicans often point to mental health, not guns, after shootings. So cutting this funding, they argued, directly contradicts that. They urged the administration to reverse the cuts, framing kid safety as nonpartisan.
A powerful critique of administrative action impacting a bipartisan law.
Definitely. And similar concerns were raised about cuts to community violence intervention funding, again attributed to the Trump administration.
How much money are we talking about there?
The speaker cited $500 million from the Department of Justice and over $1 billion from the Department of Education being cut.
That's substantial. And the impact.
They mentioned groups like Youth Alive in Oakland losing critical funding needed for their violence interruption work they do with law enforcement and the community. The speaker's reaction was just, make it make sense, highlighting the seeming contradiction of cutting funds meant to reduce violence.
So you're seeing members use the floor to directly challenge specific funding decisions made by the executive branch, pointing to real-world consequences in their communities.
Exactly. These aren't just abstract budget numbers, they're programs being affected. Now, speaking of budgets and spending, one of the longest, most detailed, and frankly, most revealing discussions in the record came from Mr. Roy.
Ah, yes, you mentioned him connecting D-Day to the debt earlier.
Right. He spoke at length about a major piece of legislation he called the Big Beautiful Bill. And he was very upfront.
How so?
He said he voted for it, but was holding his nose while doing it. Called it a Hobson's choice, basically, the least bad option available.
So he supported it, but didn't really like it.
That's putting it mildly. Yeah. His critique, especially on spending and debt, was scathing. He directly invoked the D-Day sacrifices, arguing those soldiers didn't fight for a Congress to come here and continue $36 trillion of debt and mortgage their children. and their great-grandchildren's futures.
Drawing a direct moral line from past sacrifice to present fiscal policy.
Absolutely. He hammered the cost of interest on the debt over $1 trillion a year, he said, more than the entire defense budget. And he projected it climbing to $1.5, maybe $2 trillion as rates rise. He accused Congress of running away from the tough spending fights.
Afraid of the political fallout?
That was his implication. He quoted Reagan saying, "New programs need new taxes," then blasted colleagues for offering tax cuts like selling dessert, while refusing spending cuts, eat the broccoli.
Okay. Vivid analogy.
And he took aim at the bill's supposed savings. He said the claim to $1.6 trillion over 10 years wasn't real cuts, just a reduction in planned future increases. Only about $160 billion a year, which he called peanuts when the budget had doubled to $7.2 trillion.
So, smoke and mirrors on the savings.
That was his take. He presented budget analysis showing the bill actually increases deficits in the first 4 or 5 years by $400 billion or more annually. It only might decrease them way out in the later years, which he clearly didn't believe would happen. He called it a classic Washington gimmick and a bait and switch that ultimately prevents lowering interest rates.
But he voted for it, despite all this.
Yes. He did mention one part he was proud of, Medicaid reforms. He framed them as serious reforms to reverse damage from Obamacare expansion, focusing on the idea that able-bodied adults shouldn't be on Medicaid if they aren't working.
Okay, so work requirements for Medicaid.
Right. But then he immediately kind of undercut that praise, calling it just basic enforcement, like breathing. He said the real problem, what he called a money laundering scam, wasn't addressed.
What scam was he referring to?
He claimed expansion states use provider taxes, taxes on hospitals and insurers, to essentially game the system, sending money to D.C. to get a federal match, then sending it back to the hospitals and insurers with a tax break. He argued Congress is too afraid of lobbyists to tackle this.
A pretty serious accusation about how Medicaid funding works in some states.
Very. And he was equally critical of the tax cuts in the bill. He pointed out they expire after just 4 or 5 years.
Another gimmick in his view.
Exactly. He argued Congress never lets these things expire, using past examples like the child tax credit. And he scoffed at the idea that tax cuts pay for themselves when the debt is already $36 trillion.
So if he hated the spending, the savings claims, the tax structure, why on earth did he vote yes?
He gave one reason.
Yeah.
He was very explicit about it. Restrictions on what he called green new scam subsidies.
Targeting clean energy incentives.
Yes. He said the bill aimed to terminate 55–60% of those subsidies. He went on a tear against them, saying they enrich billion-dollar corporations, send money to the pockets of the Chinese, undermine grid reliability with wind and solar, hurt natural gas and nuclear, destroy our landscape, and undermine our freedom.
Trolling language.
Extremely strong. He called Congress and the Senate weak-ass for not killing all the subsidies, as he said the president campaigned on, blaming K Street lobbyists for freaking out and preventing it.
So this one provision, cutting these specific subsidies, was enough to get his vote despite everything else.
That's exactly what he said.
Yeah.
And he ended with a direct, unambiguous threat to the Senate and the White House.
Which was?
He said, "You backslide 1 inch on those IRA subsidies, and I am voting against this bill." He flat out stated it was the only reason he voted yes the first time. He used a quote attributed to General Patton about shoveling crap in Louisiana to basically challenge Congress, asking what history would say they accomplished.
Wow. That's laying down a marker. It really shows the intense pressure points and single-issue leverage that can exist on major legislation.
It's a fascinating, raw look inside the legislative sausage-making, captured right there in the official record.
Okay. So shifting from that massive national spending bill debate, there was another extensive speech focusing on state-level policy, but framing it nationally.
Yes, this came from Mr. Kiley, who focused heavily on California under Governor Newsom.
And his argument was that California's policies are bad, and fighting them in D.C. is important for everyone.
Pretty much. He explicitly said that since Governor Newsom calls California a model for the nation, fighting those policies is serving all Americans by preventing a negative model from spreading.
So he presented it as a national battleground playing out in California.
Exactly. And he gave what he called a progress report on fighting 10 specific policies he labeled radical failed policies.
Okay, let's hear about the ones where he claimed progress based on the record.
All right. First, crazy EV mandates. He said he fought California's ban on new gas cars and trucks, his claimed success. A resolution overturning that ban passed both the House and Senate, and he stated President Trump will sign it. He also mentioned reversals on mandates for trains, buses, even lawnmowers.
So, claiming a direct federal win against a state environmental regulation.
That was the claim. Second, free Medicaid for illegal immigrants. He called this unique to California and said it was driving the state's Medicaid program broke. His claimed success, introducing a bill, applying pressure, and he said Newsom bowed and announced the policy would sunset at year's end. Though he did criticize Newsom for letting current enrollees stay on.
Okay, claiming pressure led to a state policy change.
Third, out-of-control homelessness. He called California's situation the worst in the U.S. despite billions spent. His claimed victory here was at the Supreme Court. He said the court overturned a Ninth Circuit ruling that had limited cities' ability to regulate homeless encampments.
How was he involved?
He mentioned advocating for this outcome in an amicus brief, a friend of the court filing. He argued this ruling means order is returning to our public spaces because cities like San Francisco can now legally clear encampments.
So, crediting a legal victory he supported.
Fourth, reckless crime policies. He claimed a huge win with Proposition 36 passing in California the previous November, an initiative he helped lead. He argued it made crime illegal again by restoring consequences for theft, drug use, and fentanyl dealing. He said it passed overwhelmingly despite opposition and gives law enforcement new tools, leading to real improvements.
Claiming success through a state ballot initiative he championed.
Fifth, the high-speed rail disaster. He called it the biggest public infrastructure failure ever. His claimed success involved introducing a bill to block federal funding this year and joining the federal DOT secretary in requesting an audit.
And what did the audit find, according to him?
He described the findings as damning. California, woefully out of compliance, built nothing, despite $17 billion spent over 17 years. No viable path forward. He mocked the idea of progress, citing missed deadlines and a new 2045 plan for disconnected segments that would make LA to SF travel longer than flying. He believes cutting off federal money is the beginning of the end for the project.
Using a federal audit to hammer a state project.
Exactly. Sixth, failing public schools. His focus here was attacking a new state bill, AB 84, targeting charter schools. He claimed it would shut down high-performing charters, hurt independent study and homeschool options, trap kids in failing schools, especially hurting underserved students.
What was his claimed action or success there?
He noticed some Democrats abstained from the vote, showing unease. He urged people to contact California state senators to stop the bill there. And federally, he highlighted his own bill, the High Quality Charter Schools Act, arguing it could triple charter enrollment nationwide and boost achievement.
Okay.
So fighting a state bill while promoting a federal alternative.
Got it.
Seventh, man-made water shortages. He called it absurd to have drought emergencies during big storms because of lack of water storage and diverting water. Claimed success included some diversions ending, securing federal funds for a big project called Sites Reservoir, and steps to raise the Shasta Dam level.
So, claiming progress on water infrastructure.
Right. Now, it's important to note, he listed 3 other issues: sanctuary state disgrace, catastrophic wildfires, and chaotic elections. But the record for this day didn't detail any specific actions or progress he claimed on those particular fronts.
Okay, so the takeaway here is really seeing state politics presented as a national proxy war, with a member using the federal stage to critique a state governor and claim victories against specific state policies.
Precisely. Framing his state as a cautionary tale for the rest of the country.
While all these passionate debates are happening on the floor, there's also the less visible but crucial committee work going on, right?
Absolutely. And the record gives us glimpses of that, too. We saw a summary mentioning H.R. 188 being reported out of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. That was a bill about Amtrak board meetings needing to be open. Shows that process of bills moving from committee towards the floor.
And new bills being introduced.
Yep, the bills introduced section lists them out.
Yeah.
We don't need every number, but it highlights that members have to cite the constitutional basis for their bill, usually Article 1, Section 8, a reminder of the formal grounding required for federal legislation.
And members signing on to existing bills?
That's the additional sponsors section. Just shows how bills gather support, build momentum, standard procedure.
But the record also gave specific previews of upcoming committee work.
Yes, this is really useful for seeing what's coming down the pike. It listed specific meetings scheduled for the following Monday, June 9th.
Like what?
The House Appropriations Subcommittee on Homeland Security was set to hold a markup on the FY 2026 funding bill for that department.
A markup is where they actually debate and amend the bill text, right? That's a key step.
Crucial step in the appropriations process, yeah. And the House Rules Committee had a hearing scheduled.
The Rules Committee is powerful. They set the terms for floor debate. What were they considering?
A few specific bills. H.R. 884, about non-citizen voting in D.C. elections. H.R. 2056, the D.C. Federal Immigration Compliance Act. H.R. 2096, about D.C. emergency response powers. And S. 331, the Halt All Lethal Trafficking of Fentanyl Act, the one originated in the Senate.
So those issues, D.C. governance, immigration enforcement, fentanyl, were being prioritized for potential floor action.
That's what a Rules Committee hearing usually signals, yes. And finally, the record noted the Financial Services Committee had just finished a hearing on digital assets, cryptocurrency, stablecoins, that whole world, looking at creating a regulatory framework.
Shows the committees are tackling those really complex modern policy challenges too.
Exactly. So the committee work listed really underlines the ongoing engine of legislation processing bills, setting spending, tackling new issues, and getting things ready for the full House to consider.
Okay, now, there was one more really significant speech captured in the record from this day, one that went beyond specific legislation to touch on fundamental questions of governance.
Yes, this was the speech by Representative Al Green.
Well,
It was quite something. Very passionate, very direct.
not about a particular bill, you said.
No, it was about the state of American democracy itself, as he saw it, and the role Congress needed to play. His core message was incredibly stark,
Which was?
that when you have what he repeatedly termed an authoritarian president, Congress essentially becomes the court of last resort.
The court of last resort. That's strong framing. Why did he feel that way?
He argued that authoritarianism must not be managed, it must be eliminated. He said the U.S. is founded as a democratic republic with checks and balances, but that system breaks down if the president, in his view, defies court orders, believes his executive orders override the law, and disrespects the separation of powers.
Did he give examples of the president defying courts?
He gave one very specific example. He claimed the president had not facilitated the return of a person ordered back by the courts for due process. But crucially, he said a second person, also removed without due process, was brought back after a judge ordered it.
What was his point with the two cases?
His point was that the second case proved the president knows how to facilitate a return when ordered. Therefore, the failure to return the first person was willful defiance. He accused the president of ignoring federal courts, even flouting the orders of the Supreme Court.
And he felt Congress was the only remaining check.
Yes, because he also argued that this authoritarian president had total control over Republicans in the House and Senate, preventing them from acting as a check.
So if the courts are being ignored and the president's party won't check him, where does that leave things, according to Representative Green?
It leaves it squarely with the impeachment power granted to Congress in the Constitution, Article 2, Section 4. High crimes, misdemeanors, treason, bribery. He stated very clearly, Congress is where the court of last resort lies.
And was he just talking theoretically, or did he propose action?
Oh, he proposed action, very specific action. He said impeachment is imminent, and he pledged right there on the floor to force a vote on articles of impeachment against Donald John Trump, who is now president this month, June 2025.
Wow. Force a vote this month. He called it necessary.
Necessary and a moral imperative driven by his conscience. He explained the process, House acts like a grand jury, majority vote needed, and even got into the procedural weeds.
How so?
He pointed out that voting against a motion to table the impeachment articles is effectively voting for impeachment. He directly challenged Republicans who, he claimed, had previously said impeachment was a great thing, to now vote against tabling his articles.
Putting them on the spot. Did he talk about his past efforts on impeachment?
He did. He said he laid the foundation for the first impeachment, showing a document listing the first 58 members who supported his early resolution, including John Lewis. He mentioned a second effort that got 66 supporters, aiming to build critical mass. His articles then focused on invidious discrimination, he said.
But he acknowledged those numbers weren't enough back then.
Right, and he acknowledged he might be standing alone this time. But he said that wouldn't stop him. His quote was powerful. When it is a question of conscience, it is better to stand alone than to not stand at all.
Taking a stand on principle, even if isolated.
That was the message. And he also addressed potential pushback, potential intimidation. He specifically mentioned hearing the governor of Texas has supposedly set up a commission to redraw his district lines to make it hard or impossible for him to win re-election.
Retaliation for his stance.
That was the clear implication. But his response was defiant. He said the people who elected him matter more than his job. They could take me out, but not intimidate him, and another A.L. Green would just rise up. He declared he would be censured but not silenced.
A very strong declaration of intent and resistance.
Absolutely. He wrapped up by reaffirming his belief in core American ideals, due process, free speech, voting rights, and pledged to keep fighting through protests, lawsuits, legislation, and, yes, impeachment, to make the country live up to those ideals. It was a really vivid moment, capturing the intense political and constitutional conflict over the presidency itself.
Okay, so let's try and pull these threads together. We've gone from the opening prayer and local tributes, through debates on SBA loans, aid funding, the national debt, state policies as national models, committee work, and landed on this fundamental challenge regarding presidential power and impeachment, all from one day's record.
It's really quite a spectrum, isn't it? It shows you just how broad the scope of Congress is and how many different pressures, local, national, fiscal, social, constitutional, are constantly at play.
And the disagreements are stark. On the SBA loans, it was a fundamental clash over who benefits from government programs and whether fraud concerns were legitimate. On the Big Beautiful Bill, Mr. Roy laid bare the deep dissatisfaction, even within the supporting party, about spending and legislative tactics.
Right, and the California debate showcased how state issues become nationalized political battles. The funding cut discussions highlighted the direct impact of executive actions on communities, and Representative Green's speech took the conflict to the highest level, framing it as a fight for the soul of American governance.
And it's crucial to remember, as you said, these aren't just abstract debates in Washington. The SBA loan rules affect real entrepreneurs. Mental health funding cuts impact students and families. Violence prevention funding affects community safety efforts. Debt levels impact the whole economy.
Exactly. Understanding these debates helps you connect the dots between what happens in Congress and what happens in your own life and community.
So looking ahead, based only on what we heard in this June 6 record, what are the specific things we should be watching for?
Well, the most immediate and dramatic is Representative Green's pledge to force an impeachment vote this month, June 2025. That's obviously a huge development to track.
Definitely.
What else? The big, beautiful bill that Mr. Roy discussed is heading to the Senate. His very public warning about the IRA subsidy provision means we need to watch closely how the Senate handles that specific part. Any changes there could flip votes back in the House.
A potential flashpoint.
For sure. On the state level, that California bill targeting charter schools, AB 84, still needs state Senate action. The outcome there will be significant for education in California.
And the committee actions point to near-term activity, too.
Yes. That Homeland Security Appropriations markup scheduled for Monday, June 9th, is a key step in funding that department.
And the Rules Committee hearing.
That hearing signals those bills on D.C. voting, D.C. immigration compliance, D.C. emergency powers, and the Fentanyl Act are likely heading for floor votes very soon. The Rules Committee is often the gatekeeper for major legislation.
What about the funding cuts that were protested?
Well, the calls for the Trump administration to reverse the cuts to mental health and violence intervention funding will likely continue. Whether that pressure leads to any change in policy is something to watch.
In H.R. 2966, the SBA loan bill.
Having passed the House, the next logical step is Senate consideration. The debate clearly isn't over on that intersection of immigration and economic opportunity.
So, broader trends we saw just from this one day. Intense fights over spending and debt, immigration status as a constant policy battleground, federal versus state tensions, the impact of executive orders, and just a deeply partisan climate.
Absolutely. And Representative Green's censured but not silenced line really captures the high-stakes members feel are involved in these political and constitutional struggles.
So, understanding all of this, digging into the record like we just did, that feels like the necessary first step for anyone wanting to be an informed citizen, right?
It really is. The Congressional Record itself, while maybe not beach reading, is the primary source. It lets you see what was actually said and done unfiltered.
And if people do want to dig deeper into the bills we mentioned, like H.R. 2966 on SBA loans, or H.R. 188 on Amtrak, or that Senate fentanyl bill S331.
The best place is congress.gov. Just plug in the bill number, and you can find the full text, sponsors, status, everything. It's a fantastic resource.
And if you feel strongly about any of these issues, the SBA loans, the funding cuts, the debt, whatever, contacting your own representatives is key.
Vitally important. You can find their contact info easily on a house.gov or senate.gov websites. Let them know what you think. That's how the system is supposed to work.
And tracking activity beyond the floor. Like those committee hearings?
Check the committee websites themselves. They
Yeah.
list schedules, witness lists, testimony. That's where a lot of the detailed policy work happens. You can follow the appropriations process, see what the Rules Committee is teeing up.
And participation doesn't just mean voting, right? We heard about protests, engaging with community groups.
Exactly. The tributes themselves highlighted all sorts of organizations, veterans groups, business associations, social services, advocacy groups. Getting involved locally, understanding the legislative process like impeachment or how bills move, it's all part of engagement.
It's about being involved in that messy, essential process of self-governance.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So let's leave our listeners with this thought. We heard today about profound sacrifices, like those on D-Day, made for the system of government and freedoms we have. We heard about immense challenges, like $36 trillion in debt. We heard deep, passionate disagreements about everything from who deserves an SBA loan to the very nature of presidential power and how dissent should function in our republic. Considering all that, what does it mean for you personally to uphold the principles of the Constitution and truly, as Captain Miller supposedly said, earn this today?
A lot to mull over.
Yeah.
Something to definitely think about.